Welcome back to the show. Catastrophic, deadly and destructive. That's how former PM Kevin Rudd predicts what a war between the US and China would look like. A conflict he says is no longer unthinkable.
His new book, The Avoidable War, gives a chilling insight into how this conflict could play out and what it would mean for Australia. And author and former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd joins us now in New York. Thanks for coming on the show. A lot of talk about, but first up quickly, what did you make of President Biden saying Putin cannot remain in power?
Oh, look, I think what President Biden's doing is reflecting the views of the entire democratic world, which is President Putin's behaviour is just beyond the pale. How do you treat the Russian state as a normal nation state after this has happened? I don't think he's calling for regime change. I think it's just an expression of a feeling from the heart that this is not within the norms of the international community. We can't cop it. And that's why we're all rallying behind the Ukrainians.
I think that's, I think it's unfathomable that the head of the US would say, you know, obviously there are dramas with the regime right now. Let's get rid of them. It was an off-the-cuff remark, and then they backtracked from it. Off-the-cuff remark, I mean, is that possible in Joe Biden's position? And is it plausible?
Well, mate, I've done a few of those over the years. You might recall. I think we all do when you're running a government. We're all human beings. You just occasionally just go blah. But I think he was just expressing a sentiment from the heart. Bottom line is, Putin knows, the Russians know, there's not about to be a special operations led by the CIA to go in there and decapitate the Russian leadership. That's just not possible. It's just a reflection of general frustration. But you know something? If you're sitting on the front line in Kiev at the moment, or you're one of the innocent Ukrainians having your heads blown off, I think you'll forgive a little spontaneity on the part of the US president.
OK, let's talk about your book, An Avoidable War. How seriously is that threat?
Well, we're legitimately concerned about Russia and Ukraine, but the scale of what a full-blown conflict between China and the United States would look like in the future goes right off the map. These are the two largest powers in the world, the largest economies in the world, and the two largest militaries in the world. And they're becoming more and more engaged in confrontation with each other, particularly over Taiwan, a range of other regional territorial questions as well. And so my argument is simply, and why I've written this book, is what do you do about that? How do you create some guardrails? How do you create some rules of the road between the Chinese and the United States so that you don't end up in crisis, conflict and war by accident? And that's what the book is largely about. It
was just a deal that was signed, or at least it's going to be enacted in some way, shape or form. We don't know yet. It's obviously will become clear in the next few weeks. But China and the Solomon Islands, I would have thought that's a fairly significant concern. Is there anything we can do about that, or is that cause for concern for you?
Well, it's of deep concern to me because the Solomons, if you look at the whole map of the Pacific Island countries, Carl, the Solomons is one of those countries which is quite close to Australia. It's in Melanesia. And therefore, if you're going to have in the future the risk of a Chinese naval base so close to Australian territory, you change the nature of the strategic game in our own neighbourhood. My criticism of Mr Morrison's government is one of the reactions that we get from the Pacific Island countries is that we took our aid programs away. We've ignored their concerns on climate change over the last 7 or 8 years. This has led to a lot of political alienation. My fear is it's not just the Solomons. You may see other governments beginning to reach out to Beijing as well. What can be done? As I said a day or two ago, Maurice Payne, the Foreign Minister, should have been on a plane 2 days ago to get to Honiara and to turn this thing around. It's urgent and it's important.
What does this war, or the possibility of this war, what would it look like for us? I mean, I wouldn't want that nuclear submarine base anywhere near where I live. Would they attack US military bases and our military bases?
I don't think it's worthwhile getting ahead of ourselves in terms of what it would look like here. But the scenario, broadly speaking, is this. Let's just say you had a military conflict over Taiwan. And the book, by the way, is how do you avoid that? How do you get around that? How do you manage that into the future? But if it did erupt into a war, then the scenario for escalation is fairly clear. Number one is the Chinese would presumably preempt militarily by taking out US military assets in Guam, possibly in Okinawa in southern Japan. You would then have an American counterstrike, potentially, possibly, against elements on the Chinese mainland. The idea that this would be a limited conflict between several battleships doing a duel somewhere in the Taiwan Straits does not accord with all the military scenarios that are actually underway, in my judgment. It really heightens the need, therefore, for governments to begin to put in place guardrails, rules of the road, to prevent us from getting there. And again, that's why I launched the book here in Washington. Hopefully it'll get some circulation in Beijing. I had Senator Romney launch it not far from the Capitol Hill in DC last week.
Just before we go, obviously you're missing budget. It's a big night here in Australia, and an election will be announced in the coming days. Do you miss the cut and
Not
thrust?
unhappy about
Do you miss the cut and thrust of deficits?
Well, what I find extraordinary, Carl, is that, remember when I left office at the end of 2013, that we were attacked for having a budget deficit 1/5 the size of the deficit now, for having a total debt 1/5 the size of Australia's public debt now. And remember, we were attacked by the Libs then for bringing about the collapse of civilization as we knew it. So all bets are off in terms of what this mob are capable of in this budget.
Good to talk to you, Kevin. Safe travels. The Avoidable War will be available on March 30. Appreciate your time today.
Straight